Now, in this game here, where Carlsen had the white pieces against the top Ukrainian Grandmaster Pavel Elyanov, we can see that, of course, I should say that the white rook and knight are much superior to the black rook and knight, but also the white king is superior to the black king. And we can see that the white king plays a very important role in the final 8 or 9 moves of the game. After b5, rook h8, knight b6, we see king c6. We see some pressure here against both the knight and the pawn on b5. After knight e5 check, the king stays on c5, and the question is, well, what happens after knight takes g4? Elyanov chose not to take it because he correctly assessed that after rook takes pawn, king f8, rook takes f7, king takes f7, material may be level for now, but the white king is so much more active, and so king takes b5, and this extra pawn that has just been snatched up, coupled with the king's placement perfectly placed to assist this pawn, will decide black's fate. The pawn will simply promote. And so we see a very active role played by the king. That forced black to go back to d7, and now white scooped up the pawn on b5. After king d6, the other pawn fell, and now white improved his king's position, and after knight c5 he played now king to c4. And the king on c4 is very, very irritating for black, because this pressure against the knight on c5 means that at some moment the black king may be challenged, and if it is challenged and forced to lose control of this knight, so black will lose further material. In fact, Elyanov disliked his position so intensely here that he simply resigned. Let's now take a look at another game. In this endgame, once again, it's Magnus Carlsen with the white pieces, this time against Alexander Morozevich, and the white king, which is a more active king than its counterpart, is the main reason for Carlsen's victory. Let's take a look. White goes a6, and black stops the pawn, but now white marches forward with his king. Notice this is a 6th rank king versus a 3rd rank king. After pawn to g5, the black pawns are trying to run up the board unassisted by the king, but the white pawns are much better assisted. Now black goes king e5 to get his king into play, and white should be careful about not wasting too much time with his bishop, because black's pawns can also roll up the board quite fast. However, white takes advantage of his active king, and he plays the move pawn to b5. Now after king takes bishop, well, the bishop may be lost, but 2 pawns on the 6th assisted by their king is very, very strong indeed. g4, a7, of course, black can scoop up one of the white pawns, but after king takes b6, the white pawn will win the race against these 2 pawns on the 4th. Now after g4, instead a7, g3, a8 queen, white has been successful, and although black tries his best, now b7 is able to happen, and well, with 2 queens about to show up on the board, and with black not even being that close to the promotion square, so the position is simply lost. Let's show one final game. This time it was a young Mikhail Tal in the World Team Championships in 1958. In this game here, he simply took on b5, and we can see that the material is 3 pawns for white and 3 pawns for black. However, after f4, a4, g5, and a5, we can see that the white pawn is extremely, extremely strong. It's going to be very, very fast, and if black attempts to return, then white will have the very powerful option. Let's say king to d6, white will now advance with the pawn, king to c7, and now king c5, and we see that the white king is much more actively placed than the black, and after g4, it's actually in time to stop the black pawns from promoting, and indeed to start scooping up the pawns. I can show you a line, for instance, after g3, we take, king advances towards the black pawns, collects the first pawn, and once again, it's one pawn versus one pawn, but look at the king on g3, so much closer to the target, and the king on a6, totally out of the game. If this king was anywhere within the king side, it would be a quite trivial draw. However, as things stand, we can see king b5, king g4, king c6, king h5, king d7, king takes h6, and this is a theoretical win. In fact, the point is that after, let's say, some move like king e7, g4, we can see that the king is already standing on one of the key squares. And so if key squares is a term that you're not familiar with, I encourage you to check it out. I actually made a section discussing key squares elsewhere on the site, so hopefully you can access that if you'd like to learn about king and pawn endgames and the importance of key squares. Therefore, instead, going back to the game, after a5, black played the move g4 instead of running with his king, and now white simply went king to c4 and offered him very, very similar conditions as before. If, let's say, f3, pawn takes, the king will step onto d3, and the white king, is more actively posted and able to take care of this pawn on f3, whereas the white pawn on a5 cannot be dealt with as effectively. Black is in time to catch the pawn, but he will not be in time to save the day because white will scoop up both pawns and assist with his king the advance of the h-pawn. And so we can see that king activity is tremendously important in the later stages of the game. But in the beginning, if you want to play optimally with the king, then the best thing to do is just shelter it. Castle and shelter it. And don't think about activating the king until later, much, much later on. So that covers the section. It's been quite comprehensive. I hope that you've enjoyed it, and I hope that you know how to better handle all of the different pieces in the future and what you should be looking out for. So hope you enjoyed it, and see you in a different section.